Hey everybody. Somehow that it got the verse that I wasn't like the crudest verse came to you, but it's tricky is the theme of the evening. So sorry about that. Let's get right into it. Let's say a blessing just to bring some holiness back into our learning. We'll say a blessing over our Torah study. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Welcome back from Passover. We took a week off, and we're at, I think, an important point in our discussion, a kind of a turning point in our discussion I want to offer today, which is to say that so far, we have been mostly dealing with questions of good and evil, good and bad, moral questions. What is good and evil? And how do we decide that? And then how do we do the good? And I think that's the primary reckoning that we've been moving through. And things did start to get a little complicated as our discussion progressed, as we began to think about what role God plays in all of that in a religious tradition. How do you ask the question of what is good in a religious tradition? Does God decide that? Can God ever do something that isn't good? But still, so those are complicating factors, to be sure, but still the tension that we have been dealing with is largely the tension between good and evil, tov and ra, right? That's the way it is first presented to us in the Garden of Eden, good and evil, some kind of distinction between the two. But now I want us to begin to think about, begin to ask, like, what we do when there are multiple goods, competing goods, or really just the other side of the coin, when there are multiple evils, competing evils. How do we decide between goods? And can we ever do bad in order to achieve good? And that's really the central question that I want us to struggle with a bit today. And the way that we usually phrase that is, do the ends justify the means? Okay, so far, it's Abraham who has been guiding our religious conversation, right? Because Abraham struggles with questions of good and evil. Abraham fights for the good, and sometimes doesn't fight for the good. But Abraham is always, it seems, committed to the good, or at least aware of the good. But the figure who takes us into these more complicated questions in our tradition is Jacob. Jacob, who is, he's tricky. He's tricky, right, as Run DMC would say. And it isn't really just Jacob. It's Jacob and his mother, Rebecca, right? And we'll have to think about both of them. I've become fond of saying that our avotenu, our patriarchs are not three patriarchs, but Abraham, Rebecca, and Jacob, right? Because Rebecca is really the dominant figure in that middle period and not Isaac. And we're going to see that at work as well. And there's something that Rebecca brings to the table and that Jacob really takes and runs with that is going to complicate our ethical conversation. So that's all to say that we are going to be looking at a new kind of ethical paradigm today. One that you might describe as more pragmatic, or maybe a better word is it's a realist orientation, right? Realist as opposed to idealist. Like there are certain ideals that you cannot transgress. It's just there are principles, and it doesn't matter. You always have to follow those principles. A realist approach might suggest otherwise, that yeah, there are good actions, there are good behaviors, but sometimes, you can't, sometimes in order to get somewhere, you can't exactly always be so committed to the right thing. And, on the idealist end of things, like in the sort of tradition of Western philosophy, we might point to a figure like Immanuel Kant, right, who insisted on absolute principles that were universalized and you followed them always, no matter what. And we might also think about the influence of Christianity, I think, on that side of things. And that's a voice to keep in mind in our discussion, because in some ways, what we're going to talk about tonight is a way in which Judaism diverges from Christianity. And the Christian voice I'm thinking about is the one in the book of Matthew, where Jesus says, "You've heard an eye for an eye, but I say to you, if someone hits you, turn the other cheek." In other words, you're not supposed to hit people, and it doesn't change if they hit you first. You just commit to your principles. Okay, that's idealism. A couple of influences there. On the realism end of the spectrum, the great voice, again, in the Western philosophical tradition, is Machiavelli. Machiavelli is sort of the figure most associated with this question of whether the ends justify the means. And I want to just share a little Machiavelli with you. He is so famous for this position that he has an adjective, right? Sometimes we describe a certain kind of strategy where the ends did justify the means as Machiavellian, right? That's like a way that we might describe a person as Machiavellian. And we might describe Jacob that way, actually. Okay, so let me just give you a little Machiavelli before we get to Jacob. It's just astounding. So Machiavelli is this Renaissance thinker, writer who writes this little treatise, The Prince, that seems to be a message to princes, to governors on how to run a state effectively. But there's a lot of debate over who exactly he was writing it to, but whatever it is, he becomes the paradigm of a certain kind of voice, a certain kind of answer to the question, do the ends justify the means? So let me give you a little taste of Machiavelli here, and let me share this with you first. And I want us to have this voice in our consciousness, echoing in our ears, before we get into our real subject matter, which is our own beloved tradition and the unscrupulous or tricky characters in it. Okay, so here's a source sheet for tonight. Now, this is a particularly striking chapter in The Prince, the 18th chapter, because of its title, I think, and especially in this context, because he's suddenly talking about faith and religiosity. And, as we ask these questions of good and evil or good versus good in a religious context, it's the language of this chapter that I think is particularly striking. If I can just add one more word to this introduction, the word would be cynical, right? And there's something that as we read through this, that you may identify as a cynical voice. Okay, so that's also something to keep in mind as we head in here. All right, so let's just take a look at Machiavelli here. Okay, this is the title, How a Prince Should Uphold Faith. This is chapter 18. How a prince should uphold faith. Now, everyone, he says, feels that a prince should keep the faith and live by honesty and not by astuteness. Okay, everybody feels that way. Okay, that's a nice start. I feel that way too. Our leaders should be honest. Nevertheless, says Machiavelli, one sees that princes who have done great things in our own time have held the faith in low regard. But wait a minute, he says, some of the most successful leaders do not seem to be very religious people. They have rather, by their wits, known how to get around men. In the end, they overcame men who remained faithful. Okay, so sometimes the best person does not succeed, and we see actually that sometimes the most successful leaders don't get there through their virtue, through their honesty, through their faith. Okay, so here's the basic proposition. Here's Machiavellianism. In order to maintain the state as needed, he may have to act contrary to good faith, charity, humanity, and religion. Thus, he needs to have a variable nature. Look at that phrase, a variable nature capable of changing with the winds of fortune and situations, and know how to act not just by the good, but if need be, sorry, that's a typo, if need be, by the bad. Okay? So you have a variable character, changes with the wind, and sometimes you act not by the good, but by the bad. So a prince needs to take care never to let escape from his lips anything contrary to these 5 qualities, seeming always to be compassionate, faithful, honest, humane, and religious. I love this sentence, so I bolded it. Nothing is more important than to seem to be religious. Not to be religious, but to seem to be religious, the most important thing. Why? Because men judge more by appearances than by deeds. So a prince dissimulates to win and maintain the state. Okay, there you have it. So we're not going to analyze this in great depth because I do want to take us into our Jacob stories. But I want us to keep this voice in mind as we look at Jacob and we look at Rebecca, and to ask, are they following this advice, Machiavelli's advice? And if so, what are they trying to maintain? What are the ends that justify their means? Okay, so that was a big rambling introduction, but we're now going to head in. Any questions before we do? Any clarifications, comments so far? All right, let's do it. Let's take a look now. If things are going to get really laser focused now, because we're just going to look at scenarios. The book of Genesis presents us with these sort of scenarios, these sort of ethical case studies, one after another, as soon as the Jacob story starts. So we're just going to look at a couple of them and ask the basic question, tell me, did Jacob do wrong here? Did Jacob do wrong? Okay, and we start slow. We're going to get into some really, really tangled ethical dilemmas, but let's just start slow and take a look at one of the very first scenes in Jacob's life, one of the very first scenes that we read about, which is his purchase of the birthright. Okay, so here's how it goes. Let's take a look. And your question that I'm gonna loop around and ask you at the end is: Did Jacob do something wrong? Now, this is all the material. Most of the material we're going to look at today is in Parshat Toldot. Toldot is the parsha that begins the story of Jacob and his brother Esau. So it starts off as if it's going to talk about Isaac here. This is the story of Isaac, son of Abraham, but it really goes on very quickly to talk about these two boys that were born. So it's Isaac and Rebecca, and Rebecca and Isaac at first struggle to conceive, and then they are able to conceive. And when, we'll start here on verse 24, when her time to give birth was at hand, there were twins in her womb. The first one emerged red, like a hairy mantle all over. So they named him Esau. Esau, which means like he's all done, he's cooked, right? So he came out hairy and red. He looked like a little man. And then his brother emerged, holding on to the heel of Esau. So they named him Jacob. Okay, now I start there, and I want us to really see those boys come out of the womb, because there's something about their characterization that will be relevant to our consideration. And especially, I would say, the characterization of Jacob, who from the very first is grabby. Okay, he's grabby. Like his name literally means something like heel grabber. He like grabbed on. So Esau's the firstborn, and Esau comes out first, but Jacob's holding on, already kind of in the mix. Okay, so then the boys grew up, verse 27 here, and Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the outdoors, but Jacob was a mild man who stayed in camp. And Isaac favored Esau because he had a taste for game, but Rebecca favored Jacob, okay? And the parents played favorites. Okay, here it is. This is our first case study. So here's the situation. You tell me, did Jacob do wrong here? Or is this okay? So once, when Jacob was cooking a stew, Esau came in from the open, from the field, famished. And Esau said to Jacob, give me some of that red stuff to gulp down, for I am famished. Right? He's a bit of a brute, so he's like, "Arr, give me some of that stuff," which is why he was named Edom. He got a nickname. Edom means red. So apparently, this is the idea here is maybe they started calling him red around then because he loved red stuff. Okay, so he asked for this red stew, red lentil stew. Jacob said, first, sell me your birthright. First, sell me your birthright. Okay. And Esau said, I'm going to die, so of what use is my birthright to me? Who cares? But Jacob said, well, swear to me first. So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. Jacob then gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and Esau ate and drank, and he rose and went away, and thus did Esau spurn or disregard the birthright. Okay, the Bechorah, that's the word here for birthright, Bechorah, which means the firstborn. He's the firstborn, and in ancient societies, the firstborn took the larger share of the inheritance. And in this case, the inheritance includes God's blessing. So it's a big deal. Or maybe I'm already loading too much onto it. Let's just take the story simply. Esau's the firstborn. He has certain rights. Jacob's the secondborn. Even though they were twins, he came out second. And Jacob gets Esau to sell him the birthright. I'm not even sure, like, one might ask, is that possible? Can he do? But right now I just want to ask, is it ethical? Is it okay what Jacob did? Because Jacob leaves this little story holding the right to the firstborn. So you tell me, what do you think? Is this a story in which Jacob can be criticized, or did he do the right thing? Did he fly by the book? What do you think? Let's open up our conversation. Been talking long enough here. What do you think? Alexandra, start us off.
I have a feeling I'm going to be in the minority, but I think he did the right thing and it's fine. And my thinking is, like, if we think he did not do the wrong thing, like, where does that end? Like, where are business contracts not okay? And here's why I think he did the right thing. I think the bread is a big clue. Esau just wanted the stew, but there was clearly other food around. So clearly he wasn't dying. He was using hyperbole, and they were a rich community, a rich tribe. There was other food, but he specifically wanted that. Jacob covered his bases. He said, swear to me. And then after he had eaten, he got up and left, and he didn't care. He didn't change his mind. So I think that it's fine. I think that my question is, when people have a strong argument that what he did was wrong, my question is, like, where then are business contracts okay, and where are they not okay?
Okay, great. This is beautiful, and I beautifully put, and you're framing one side of our conversation nicely. And I don't necessarily think you have to be in such a severe minority here, because you make a very reasonable case. It's just a sale. It's just a sale. There's nothing wrong. What, all of business is now unethical? It's just a sale. He wanted something. He offered something. It's a fair exchange. Isn't that the whole ethic of our entire economy? Is that free agents can make exchanges, can contract with one another. And Esau, Alexandra points out, seems to show that he is absolutely consenting to the sale because he doesn't care about it. He says, I don't care about it. I don't need this, right? So there's no problem. And we might just leave it there. Does anyone want to weigh in on another side? I'm going to take the hands in the order I saw them. So RBZ, Rabbi Zaki, what do you think?
So I sort of have this scale thing, like a mediation situation if it was going to court. And I think that Jacob holds the value of the firstborn in his thinking and doesn't want it to just slip through the cracks and the value of it not happen. But then there's another way to look at it. So it would be, there was no bartering or anything. It was just yes or no, and you take the lentils and I'll take the birthright. So I just,
Okay. All right.
it just made me, it seems, I keep going back to that word, seems like it's, you know, a little weird. Thank you.
Okay, good. All right, good. So Rabbi Zaki is beginning to like poke a little bit here, but answers before she does, Rabbi Zaki says, wait a minute, it's not just that it was a sale, but there's a sense that you get that Esau is not the right person for this birthright. Jacob cares about it. It isn't just that Esau didn't care, it's that Jacob understands the importance of this. And that Rabbi Zaki is pointing us towards like the real conflict, the real tension that we're going to feel as we move further into this story, which is that there's some sense, I mean, if only retrospectively, because now we're the children of Israel. So we sort of feel like, well, sure, that guy had to be the one. He was the right one. But the whole story seems to set Jacob up as the right one. Or does it? Right? Esau doesn't care, and maybe he's not maybe he is a bit of a brute, and that's not the right person to inherit the birthright. So what do you do? I'm sort of elaborating Rabbi Zaki's last point. What do you do when there's a rule, there's an order, there's a system for passing on inheritance, but it's gonna go in the wrong direction? And what happens if Esau gets a birthright? The whole tradition ends. I mean, okay, so I'm already getting ahead of myself, but Rabbi Zaki was pointing us in that direction. All right, let's take a couple more comments. I saw Matt Silberstein's hand up.
Yeah. So my first thought about this is that if Esau is exaggerating, then he's going to figure that he's being exaggerated back. It isn't a contract. I said I'm going to die, and you say you want everything. I say, okay, fine, I'll give you everything. That isn't really a contract. It isn't really an agreement. But I think that kind of misses the point of this. I think it is a unethical situation to do an ask there, to do a big ask. It isn't just a, you know, this is a family and they're doing stuff together. They aren't exchanging and contracting and trading off. But narratively, we have to have the second born. So we allow this to happen because narratively we need it, not ethically or anything else.
Okay,
but
good.
The whole point of the book is to give secondborns first place. And so we're going to allow, but Jacob's not right. He's not doing what he did.
All right. Okay, good. So Rabbi Zaki was beginning to sort of sniff out something doesn't feel right in this scene, and Matt gives it really full voice. Matt says, they're brothers. Is this how okay, there's such a thing as a sale, but this is how a family does its internal, most sacred business of who will, I mean, the whole thing feels very rushed, doesn't it? It just sort of happens, and all of a sudden Jacob's got it, and now may I add that Esau is starving. Okay, Alexandra said, wait, there was bread around. So Alexandra's thinking about, is Esau really starving? But the text makes a point of saying he just needs food right now. Now, he's not about to die right that moment, and that's not probably what he's saying. But it's not, it's a situation of what we would call duress. Right? That might be a way of kind of poking holes in Jacob's behavior here. But Matt gives us an important framework also, which is just to say, this isn't how a family, there might be an ethical sale of something like this, but we have to think about the context. And when two brothers are talking in this way, something has gone awry, okay? All right, let's take one more look at this scene, and then we're gonna up the ante a little bit. Florine, will you offer one last thought on this scene?
I think the unethical one is Esau. If if Esau had a firm grip on tradition and ethics and on blessings, he would have immediately said no. So I think we're looking at this story, we're looking at the wrong person.
Okay. So what Florine gives us, beautiful, thank you, and giggling as she does. What Florine gives us is actually, I think, the traditional voice. Like, this is the voice of the tradition, and we've touched on it already, but this really becomes the central concern of the early tradition, which is the character of these two people. And Esau just doesn't seem like, he doesn't get it, he doesn't respect it. The last of he disgraced it, really, is the language there. He didn't just spurn it, he threw it aside. Yeah. And we're getting a sense that this is not the guy that we want this covenant to pass through, right? So not only is Jacob the person who should have the blessing, but he did get it fair and square, I mean, technically, so all is well, right? That is, Florine is offering us that read, and that is a very well-established read in the tradition, that Esau's really the problematic character here, and phew, thank God that Jacob seized the moment. Okay, but things are going to get, we're going to build on this tension, but things are going to get much more difficult to resolve as we move to, we're in the same Parsha here, Parsha Toldot, which really does a lot of this work of sort of complexifying all of the principles that have been established so far in the book of Genesis. But okay, we had a little sail here. We could think about whether it feels a little off, but whatever it is, it's done. Jacob bought the birthright. And now, fast forward, and Isaac, we come upon Isaac on his deathbed, really. Is sort of like he's aging and he's getting frail, and he's realizing that it is time to, well, time to what? What seems important to him is to give over a blessing, okay? Now, whether or not that blessing is about the same kind of stuff that we were just talking about, the birthright stuff, that's one of the complicated questions that is part of our conversation, but let's just hold that for now and get into what I think is a trickier ethical dilemma. And again, I'm going to ask you, did Jacob do right? Actually, in this case, the first question I'm going to ask you is, did Rebecca do right? Okay, so let's take a look. We were in chapter 25, and now we're in chapter 27. Okay, so not so far away. These guys are growing up, and they're, we have this scene in our memory, but okay, moving on. And now Isaac is old. Isaac was old, and his eyes were too dimmed to see. So listen, he is old and going blind. He's really in a frail and vulnerable state here, okay? And he calls to Esau, and he says, I'm old, and I don't know how soon I may die. So you take your gear, your quiver and bow, and go out into the open and hunt me some game. Get me something to eat, and then come and make me some food. There's like a whole ceremony here, and bring it to me to eat, so that I can give you my innermost blessing. Tivarechacha nafshi. I'm going to give you the blessing of my soul. Now, that's okay, not totally sure what that means, but Rebecca seems to feel like it's a big deal, okay? Because Rebecca, first of all, as we think about ethical questions, Rebecca is eavesdropping here, although I imagine it's a small tent. But Rebecca had been listening as Isaac spoke to his son Esau, so his son Esau, right? What about hers? But Rebecca had been listening, and when Esau had gone out into the open to hunt game to bring home, Rebecca said to her son Jacob, remember, she loved Jacob more. Isaac loved Esau more. I overheard your father speaking to your brother Esau, saying, bring me some game and prepare a dish for me to eat, that I may bless you before the Eternal before I die. Now, my son, Jacob, listen carefully as I instruct you. Go to the flock, and fetch me 2 choice kids, 2 little goats, and I will make of them a dish. I will make of them a dish for your father, such as he likes. Why Isaac needs food to give a blessing is a separate question, but we'll leave that one aside. And then take it to your father to eat in order that he may bless you before he dies. Okay. Well, okay, so he's going to run in there and get the blessing first, but Jacob says that doesn't work. He wants to bless Esau. Okay, so what? Not only am I going to try to race in and cut Esau off, but that's not, he's not going to bless me. And so Jacob says to his mother Rebekah, but my brother Esau's a hairy man, and I'm smooth-skinned. If my father touches me, I shall appear to him as a trickster, and bring upon myself a curse and not a blessing. But his mother said to him, your curse, my son, be upon me. Just do as I say and go and fetch them for me. Okay? And okay, so go ahead and do it. And how are they going to get around the there's one more level to add here. How are they going to get around the fact that indeed they do look different, though they are twins? And so here's the final blow here. He got them and brought them to his mother, and his mother prepared a dish such as his father liked. Rebekah then took the best clothes of her older son Esau, which were there in the house, and had her younger son Jacob put them on. And she covered his hands and the hairless part of his neck with the skins of the goats. And then she put the hands of her son Jacob the hands of her son Jacob, the dish and the bread that she had prepared. Okay, so dress up like Esau, go to your blinding father, and pretend to be Esau. And when and don't worry, he'll see you in Esau's clothes, and he won't see your smooth skin. And if all that weren't, and so far we can ask the question, did Rebekah do wrong? But let's just go a couple of more lines so we can also ask, did Jacob do wrong? Because so far Jacob seems a little helpless, like a pawn in this game. But then Jacob goes into his father and says, Father, and Isaac says, yes, which of my sons are you? That's already a little weird. And Jacob said to his father, it is I, Esau, your firstborn. And I have done as you told me, etc., etc., etc. So, okay, so there it is. Jacob's implicated now, okay? Lies to his father. I am Esau, your firstborn. Okay, so did Rebekah do wrong? Here, I'm assuming the answer is yes, right? I mean, didn't she, is there any way to justify this? Like, did she do wrong here? Elizabeth, you want to unmute yourself for us?
Yeah, she had been watching these 2 boys grow up for a long time, and she saw that one of them was really going to honor this tradition, and the other one was a brute hunter, whatever. And she made a decision. She said, this one is not going to honor, it's like pearls before swine. Like, how can we give it to him when he's not going to know what to do with it? I will take it upon myself to betray my husband in a way, because that's what she's doing, but to give it to the right person. And I think at some point it said you will have 2 nations and the younger will serve the older and whatever. So I think it was a very conscious decision for Rebekah to do this, watching her 2 sons and deciding which one was the right one for the job.
Beautiful, beautiful. I'm so thrilled with your comments, Elizabeth. You put it all so nicely, so crisply, because now we're at the question. Right? Do the ends justify the means? Because in the earlier story, first of all, it was a sale. I guess it was okay technically. And, we're thinking about Jacob kind of fending for himself and Esau fending for himself. But here, Elizabeth imagines that Rebekah's looking at the big picture. Okay, and Rebekah she's the matriarch. She's the adult in the family, especially now that Isaac is in decline. She's thinking about the future, and she just realizes Esau cannot be the person who takes this on. And Isaac, I don't know, he's delusional. He doesn't seem to get it, but Esau is not the right person to carry this tradition forward. This is our religion. This is our covenant. Esau? No way. It's got to be Jacob. It's got to be Jacob. And Elizabeth reminds us, and I wasn't going to hide this ball from you for too much longer, but Elizabeth snatches it, and she's exactly right, that we started looking at the story just after the boys were born. But if we back up a few lines, we find that Rebecca's actually got secret information. Okay, so let's just take a look at that for a second, just a couple of lines here. But remember, Isaac and Rebecca had trouble conceiving, and they did some praying. And then Rebecca went, the children struggled, they did conceive, but they struggled inside her womb. She had pains in pregnancy. And she said, if so, why am I like this? Why do I exist? So she went to inquire of the eternal. She went to go ask God a question. And God said to her, and this is like a prophecy, okay? God's talking to Rebecca here. And God says, 2 nations are in your womb. This isn't just twins. This is 2 huge future peoples. 2 separate peoples shall issue from your body. Amazing thing to hear from God, right? 2 separate peoples shall issue from your body. 1 people shall be mightier than the other. And look at these last lines. Virav yavod sa'ir. And the older shall serve the younger. Now, that's poetic and it's prophecy. It's hard to know exactly what it means, but it does seem like Rebecca's got some information that nobody else has. She's heard directly from God that there's a tension here, and that it should be that Esau is subservient to Jacob. All right, that's at least one way to read it. So she knows what needs to happen, and she's making it happen. Now, isn't that the right thing to do? Right? She has to lie to her husband. She has to get her son to lie to his father. She has to betray her own son. She has to do all these things, but she's doing it for the big picture, right? As Machiavelli would say, to maintain the state. So what do you think? Bob, what do you think?
So I think there is the justification, and yes, Rebecca knew what the end story was going to be. God told her, but the part I've always been troubled about this is the deception, and if Rebecca heard from God, there's no mention here that she then told her husband about this foretelling of the story by God. And I've always been troubled that Jacob had this agreement with Esau, but he never came to his father and say, hey, my brother and I, we had this agreement. And I also think of all that time of Rebecca and Jacob living and getting older, and they're like living with these secrets, and it must have been a great a great hardship for them. On top of it, they knew it was going to be building to this climax, but I've always felt that there were and maybe the Bible just doesn't tell that part of it, but there must have been opportunities to clear the ground for this before this like final act of true deception. And just one other thing I'll put out there, I've always been troubled by the fact that Isaac was blind, and just like taking advantage. It was even more than deception. It was taking advantage of a blind person like this. And these are our forefathers. It's just very, very troubling all around.
Very troubling all around. Well put. Yeah, no, okay, great. So Bob here is reminding us of just how dysfunctional this family dynamic is. Like, we can look at this as an ethical problem in the abstract and say, well, maybe Jacob bought the birthright, and so actually it belongs to him. It all works out in the end. Like, is that what happened? Or maybe Rebecca got the prophecy and she knows the way it has to happen. So she had to do this. We can answer these questions this way, but Bob makes a very simple but really kind of penetrating point here, which is, why don't they just talk about it? Don't they love each other? Aren't they a family? Can't they Do they have to lie to each other within? Is this? Matt was already saying, when you think of two brothers, this isn't the way they should be talking to each other. Well, when you think of a loving partnership here, husband and wife, dealing with their two children, who, by the way, they should both love both of them, right? Like, there's already a problem. We heard early on that one of them likes one of them likes the other. Like, what's there? In other words, it may be that we can find some ways to justify Jacob's behavior or Rebecca's behavior, but there's still something icky about the way it all plays out. There's something wrong here. There are the ends may justify the means, but the means are pretty problematic here. Okay, Amy Schweiger.
I'm struck by it's Rebecca who has the prophecy and not Isaac. And I'm looking at the text, there's the callback to the story of the Akedah with the Hineni, that did the prophecy come to Rebecca because Isaac was still damaged and could not see the future? If he's our patriarch, you would think he would be thinking about the future of our people, but it's fallen to Rebecca's shoulders. So I'm wondering about the dysfunction, maybe calling back to that seminal event.
Yeah, that's well put, Amy. And this is what I mean by saying that the matriarchs, the Avotenu are really Abraham, Rebecca, and Jacob, because you can see that Isaac is sort of in decline here, and Rebecca sort of seizes the moment and shapes the future. Right? She really rises and takes charge of the family here. So there is this way in which you really see, Rebecca's power here. And Jacob is his mother's son, right? He's going to take it and run with it. And look, part of what I am trying to suggest here is that we have to figure out what to do with Rebecca and Jacob, because we inherit them. We inherit Rebecca and Jacob. Whatever they did, we're living with it. It, like, quote unquote, all worked out, right? There is deception is part of the way that we got to where we are as a people, or at least the way the narrative gets to where it needs to go. So now we're really kind of brought face to face with this question that we started with. Do the ends justify the means? Is it okay to do unethical things if you know that in the end, it will lead to a better world, a better solution, right? And now we begin to think about Rebecca as overseeing two nations, right? And think again about what Machiavelli says, someone who's overseeing the welfare of an entire state. Well, you're gonna have to make some decisions that hurt some people, aren't you? Isn't that okay? When you're in a position of leadership, sometimes you gotta lie. Sometimes you gotta sacrifice some people, eminent domain, for the good of all, right? So now we're really, I don't know, I guess I'm really just asking that question. Do the ends ever justify the means? And particularly so in big questions of leadership. Rachel Newman.
So in this case, I just think it's really fascinating. The idea that Rebecca does have this kind of communication directly with God and gets this information. It doesn't say that she should take part. It doesn't say that she should take part, but the fact that she does have the communication seems to sort of imply this special position, obviously, that she has as the mother. And as the mother, she's witnessing these boys so closely. Isaac is obviously, he's not in touch with the deepest part of them. So, I think it's, she sees who the man is going to be that's going to lead the people in the best way, right? And for the good the continuing generations. And because she has this direct connection, she obviously has this sort of specialness. I don't know if that's the right word. I'm lost for words, but yeah, I mean, I think it's a really great example of showing when, we talked in our last session about when humans actually have to take this leap of faith, to make these things happen, that there is human agency in the path of our people. And so I think there's that's where it's sort of the free will and the human agency is displayed, and the ends do justify the means, right? Yeah.
Okay, great. This is great. So Rachel reminds us that we've got a prophetess here, right? This is not just oh, it's a story and people making decisions. It's she heard the message and she knows she's got to execute it. And, as Rachel narrates this story, it makes me think, oh, well, we can debate this till the cows come home, but it seems like the Torah wants us to side with Rebecca, right? The Torah gave her the message. The Torah said that Esau spurned the birthright, right? The Torah is setting this up so that, it wants us to see how the ends justify the means. And let me make that case even stronger by just showing it with it. Parshat Toldot, this parsha in the Torah, this section in the Torah that we're reading from, is one of the great masterpieces of the Torah. It is just an incredibly beautifully written parsha, and one of its kind of greatest tricks is that it plays around with language here, as probably some of you noticed, in that the birthright, right, this thing that Jacob bought at the outset, is the Bechorah. This is the word in Hebrew, Bechorah, and here I've translated it, Bechorah. The word for blessing, some of you will know, is Beracha. Same word, same letters there, but you just flip the middle two letters, okay? Now, that's not a coincidence. The Torah is doing that, okay? The Torah is playing with us. And I don't know what the Torah is saying, but there is this way in which the Torah is deliberately making the connection to that earlier scene and showing us that there's a kind of, well, but there's no resolution. There's a kind of ambiguity. Did Jacob buy the birthright already, or did he not? Is it the same thing or is it not? Right? The Torah is confusing us on purpose, but also inserting this kind of narrative that we could follow, which makes sense of it all. And it starts with that prophecy that Rebecca got. Okay. We have time for a couple more thoughts here. I see Hannah, Julia, and Ellen. We'll try to get to them all before we close. Hannah Jensen.
Hi. Okay. I have some problems. Number one, I want to echo something that Jody put in the chat, which is, how do we know that Esau wouldn't have been a good leader? And I think that part of what I struggle with so much in the story is that, yeah, we're the people of Jacob. So now we look at this story in a light in which we just say the goal is justify Jacob's actions because we come from Jacob and we want to be able to keep him on a pedestal. We want to be able to say he was a great person. And I say he wasn't. Maybe he got there. That's great. But I think he screwed a lot of stuff up at the beginning, and so did Rebecca, and so did Isaac in some ways. And I think the question I often have is, what about Esau? It's easy for us to say, of course the ends justify the means because look what happened. We're this great people. None of that happens without Jacob. But what if our people are Esau's people? How is it so easy for us to just separate him completely? He comes from Isaac too. He comes from Rebecca also. These are our ancestors. They're the same. And yet we say, no. We're casting that off. We're not engaging with him. We don't really even follow what happens to him or his descendants. In fact, we think of them as our enemies in some ways along the way. And what if we're them? Why can't we see each other as one? And how does that actually complicate it more instead of feeling like, oh, we won, good against evil? Maybe we didn't win. And maybe even if we did, we're not good. maybe we're flawed just like everyone else. And Esau was just a person trying to learn how to be a person in the world like everyone else. And I also think that there's something about Jews that we really, really honor and revere text and learning and study as the right way to show that you're an accomplished person or leader. And Esau had other skills. Who's to say that being a hunter, that using your hands, that having other kinds of knowledge aren't also just as valuable? How do we, I think in this way, we kind of make this hierarchy of what looks like justifiable, what looks like leadership based on these ideas that maybe aren't actually serving us.
Okay, all right. An impassioned defense of Esau here, and very, very, very well said, Hannah. That is, Esau hasn't done anything wrong. Let's not forget that. It's so easy to kind of write him, oh, and he's a brood, and he was hairy. Oh, he was hairy. Who cares? He's not done anything wrong. What is wrong with Esau? Other than history is written by the victors, right? Like, of course Esau's bad now because the lineage went through, but there's something wrong here. And maybe the Torah wants us to consider that. In other words, maybe what we have to deal with is, yeah, it quote unquote all worked out and we inherited and this is our people, but there are problems in that. We got to where we are through some ethically problematic decisions and moves, and we have a tarnished inheritance, and that's just the way it is. The Torah isn't full of perfect characters, and maybe Jacob is one of the least perfect of them all, and that's just, we're actually supposed to feel sympathy for Esau, and we're supposed to be troubled by Jacob's whole life, but let alone this episode, and that's actually part of what we're left with here, part of the moral message that the Torah is delivering to us, right? That, yeah, sometimes the ends do justify the means, but we shouldn't feel good about that, or maybe they shouldn't have, right? We're still left with that, still struggling with that. Okay, Julia Berg.
Yeah, I want to go back to Rebecca specifically and just the prophecy that she receives, because it is so big. By no means is she told, you should make sure that in order for the younger to overtake the older, he needs to get the blessing and before that even get the birthright and all of that. But she takes it into her own hands and uses that power of interpretation and that very feminine power that we see in the Torah, that it's one of her only ways to getting power. And I'm really struck by that. And I really love this Torah portion and just like this prophecy and trying to unpack that. And so I feel like that's also coloring the way that I want to view whether it's for good or for bad, and whether the ends justify the means. But I think there is something to be said about her use of power here, and that she's taking agency in that moment.
I love this insight. That's such an important thought, which sort of turns the whole situation on its head. Let's think for a moment about how much power women had in this society, in tribes, in families. So what do you do if you're the woman of the house and you don't really get to decide anything, but you're actually the prophetess, and you're actually the smartest one, and you're actually the person who should be making decisions, and your husband, God bless him, he's a meek guy and he's in decline? What do you do? How do you assert power in a world which has no power available to you? Does that change our ethical calculus? I think that's a really important thought. That's a really, really important thought. All right, let's take one more comment from Ellen Cleary.
Thank you. I'm really glad the conversation is going in this direction, because I really feel very much like Bob and Hannah. I feel like often we try to make a square peg fit into a round hole in trying to justify what Rebecca does here. I can a little bit justify Jacob. I mean, I think there's a hint in that part of the story that Esau doesn't really value his birthright, and there's an indication of that in his willingness to sell it so readily and then get up and leave as if he has no second thoughts about that. But what kind of dysfunctional marriage is this that Rebecca doesn't discuss any of this with Isaac? She only feels like she has to make all of this happen. And how in the world, in a family where all of this occurs, I mean, we think of ourselves as a wonderful big family, but how in a family like this can these people come back together and truly love and respect and care for one another? I find this story very deeply problematic.
Yeah. Yeah, that is a good question to end on, Ellen's question. What does this do to the family? What does it do to these people in the long term? Okay, so yay, it all worked out and the birthright went the right way and, you know, he bought it earlier anyway, and look, all the justifications we can provide, but what does it do to these people? Right? Esau cries when he realizes what's happened, right? He wants to kill his brother. Suddenly there's murderous desire in the family. Jacob has to be sent away from the family for decades because he can't live now anymore in this constellation. Right? Like, what happens here? And what is it like when Jacob leaves? What's it like between Rebecca and Esau? Right? What's it like between Rebecca and Isaac? Right? But you know, we'll leave them aside. I think following the direction of the Torah, we can also ask the question, what is it like to be Jacob? What is it like to be Jacob after this? How does this shape Jacob? Because Jacob, these are just the opening scenes in Jacob's life. But this pattern continues. Jacob, and Hannah was saying this earlier, Jacob continues to be a deeply problematic character, right? He continues to deceive and to be deceived. The next place he goes, his father-in-law will trick him. And you know what his father-in-law says to him when he tricks him into marrying the older sister instead of the younger? He says, we don't do that we don't do that here where we live, marrying the younger off before the older, which is a little bit of a hint, like, we don't do like you do, okay? We follow the rules here. And then Jacob will trick Lavan, and there'll be tricking and deception. Next time that Jacob meets Esau, he'll trick Esau again. Jacob becomes a certain kind of person. And, you know, maybe the consequences, the end result, seem to justify the means. But the character of the people involved is what Ellen is asking us to consider. And I'll just end by, you know, we're going to continue to follow Jacob, and next week we're going to look at Jacob and his problematic character in the disturbing episode where his daughter is assaulted. But I just want to give us one last teaser to give you a sense of who this Jacob is that leaves this situation. Because Jacob does flee from his home. He's sent out to Rebecca's brother's household. And as he leaves, he lies down for the night. He has this amazing dream of the ladder and angels going up and down the ladder. And he's like in contact with God. He has his first religious experience. And this is how he reacts to it. So take a look at this last text here. Jacob awoke from that dream and said, oh my gosh, God is here in this place and I didn't know it. Shaken, he said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the abode of God, and that is the gateway to heaven. Okay, he's had the most profound religious experience of his life. And what does he do? Early in the morning, Jacob took the stone that he had put under his head and set it up as a pillar and poured oil on top of it. And then he named the site Bethel, and it had previously been called Luz. But then take a look at this. Jacob then made a vow saying, if God remains with me, if God protects me on this journey that I'm making and gives me bread to eat and clothing to wear, and if I return safe to my father's house, then the Eternal shall be my God. And I got to tell you, the commentators are astounded by that language. Like, what? That's how you talk to God? Like, you just You just saw into the heavens, and your response is, I'll tell you what I'll do, God. If you give me food to eat and safe passage, then I will allow you to be my God. We'll make a deal. He's still making deals. He's making deals now with the Almighty, with the transcendent force of the universe, right? Which is the first hint that we get that Jacob has become someone. He's become a trickster. He's become a strategist. And yeah, like, you know, in some way that we're going to continue to grapple with for the rest. We have grappled with for all of our history and will continue to grapple with for the rest of our history. This is our ancestor. This is the person that we come from. In some way, yeah, it all worked out. But if we look at the figure of Jacob and the person that he became, there's something about it right to the end that leaves us a little uncomfortable and leaves us continuing to ask the question, did the ends really justify the means? Okay, so we'll leave it there. Pick up more next week and more stories of Jacob's troubling life. Thanks, everybody. Good learning with you tonight. Welcome back after our Passover break, and happy spring to you all.